I'm going to speak for nearly 5 minutes, very short amount of time, about archives in general, and then Helen's going to talk a bit more about Sheffield Archive in particular. So I thought it was important to talk about archives because in the historical profession they're sometimes treated with a bit of awe, they're seen as kind of the source of knowledge, or they're seen as quite dusty places, intimidating places, perhaps exciting places. But kind of beyond the work of the history department, there's often quite a lot of confusion about what archives are. And I think that's because archives mean such different things and are such different things. Does the microphone not work? I think it's not on. Oh no, it's not on. So archives can mean very different things. You might talk about having an archive in your home, having the documents that are important to you or that have some official meaning, birth certificate, passport, marriage certificate, things like this. The kinds of archives that historians use take different forms, and so you might, these are some examples of archives. The National Archive, which is full of government records, Sheffield City Archives, which we'll be visiting today, and then more specific ones, so the British Deaf History Archive, collecting information from deaf schools which have since closed, or the National Fairground Archives, which are again based in Sheffield, or the Race Relations Library, which is quite a different kind of archive, which is collecting things to do with race relations, immigration, multiculturalism across the country and putting them together in Manchester. So going back to the previous slide, archives can be anything that's a collection of material, but it has hopefully it's an organised collection of material, it's a storage system, it's a repository for finding information, it's raw material. So the kinds of things that we look at in archives are documents written by people such as Edward Carpenter rather than books written about Edward Carpenter. And also archives have been discussed as a community memory or a repository of memories. And I think that's something that's quite interesting to us here today, is thinking about how we can use, we can mine archives for a sense of past, a sense of belonging, a sense of who we are, and a sense of how we might use our histories. I also wanted to say a couple of cautionary things about archives, which is that because archives are generally made by organisations or people or collections of people for specific purposes, they're not made for the purpose of historical research. They're not made for the benefit of historians. They're surviving records. And sometimes they're not even stored for the benefit of the historians. So they're stored in a particular way, but that might not be the most helpful way for say, us researching Edward Carpenter. And one of the challenges of doing historical work is always to grapple with that structure and to try and work out how we can find information in them that might not be listed or catalogued in the way in which is relevant to the kinds of research questions we're looking at. And this is one of my favourite pictures of archives. It's a picture of Holland House Library in the Blitz. And I've just put it there because there are lots of gaps in archives, and some of these are complete accidental damage, bombing in this case, flooding. I think if you remember back to the first workshop we did with Sasha, she was talking about how lots of the records about India and the mills had been lost. There seemed to be fires or floods, and they've been destroyed. So there are just these holes in the archive. But we might also talk about more deliberate holes in the archive, things about neglect, censorship, are other reasons why particular documents, particular records might have been thrown away and why we might not be able to retrieve them. And also, on a much more mundane note, my final slide is a quite depressing image for a historian of material being lined up to be destroyed. So Archives have very limited space. They're under, well, at the moment they're under huge funding cuts. And archivists are constantly having to make very difficult decisions about what they can preserve, what they're going to invest in, and what we're not. And clearly, in this case, the Archive of the Northern Cape were having a major clear out and destroying all these documents, which presumably they had considered not to be so important. And let's just hope that the documents that we might find about Edward Carpenter haven't met a similar fate. But I'm going to hand over to Helen to talk more specifically about Sheffield.
I just have one question before you.
Oh, yes, of course.
Which is that, we learned some time back that Google was trying to digitize all the archives and bring them to electronic media. So at some point of time, we are hoping that you won't have this kind of problem where you actually store archives in physical medium and then have the problem preserving them.
That would be great. I'm not feeling very optimistic about it being very thorough. And a lot of decisions are having to be made about what is digitalised in the same way as what is stored. So some of the archives, the census records, for example, have been digitalised and they're fantastic, but others haven't. And what I fear is that some of them, by not being digitalised, will then become redundant and lost in such processes. Sorry, it's quite a gloomy response. But some archives are changing and some are becoming more digitalised.
Well, that's a brighter side.
Yes, that's a brighter side.
Thanks, Esme. So that was our expert in imperial history. I think she focuses on India and South Africa, if I remember right.